How would you like to come and speak to a room full of your target readers? They have questions, you have the answers. They have problems, you have the solutions. You have a burning message on your heart from your book for your target readers, right? If only there was an event already planned, all the details taken care of, the attendees already invited and waiting, and you just have to show up. You don't even have to do your makeup or hair. You just show up to serve. Would you say yes? That's what we're talking about on today's episode. So let's get to it. So are you thinking, heck yeah, where do I sign up for the speaking event where my target readers have gathered, waiting for my message, and all I have to do is show up and serve? Or maybe you're thinking, like me, that sounds great and all, but I'm not a speaker. I can't get up on stage. That is not for me. I have those thoughts. But remember, marketing is simply letting people know we can help them. Speaking is for all of us, especially when we're talking about being a guest on podcast. All we have to do is show up to serve. Your podcast host is your event coordinator. They've done all the hard work for you. They've been called to a unique mission to serve their listeners. They've created a regular event, which is a podcast, to encourage and inspire their listeners on a consistent basis. And guess what? Those listeners are likely your target book readers. Podcast hosts have done all the hard work for you. They've built a loyal community of listeners who show up week in and week out, listeners who are engaged, listeners who trust their host to bring them conversations that bring value to their busy days. And as event coordinators, what do podcast hosts need? Speakers. Speakers they can trust to bring value to their listeners. Speakers with a message that matches the mission of their show. And in most cases, the podcast is recorded. It's not live. So if you have stage fright, no worries. It's not a live audience. Thank God for that. It's just a conversation between two people, yourself and the podcast host. But that conversation has the potential to serve many. The podcast listeners who show up week in and week out, and new listeners that discover the show weeks, months, or sometimes years after your guest episode goes live. New listeners equal new readers. So back to my original question. How would you like to come and speak to a room full of your target readers? Or in this case, a podcast full of your target listeners. They have questions, you have the answers. They have problems, and you have the solutions. And you have a burning message on your heart for your target readers, right? If only there was an event already planned, all the details taken care of, the attendees are already invited and waiting, and you just have to show up to serve. Would you say yes? So in this episode, I want to highlight 9 ways guesting on podcasts can help you build your author platform by meeting new readers, marketing your message, and making a bigger impact online. You know, often we see authors, especially those traditionally published, guesting on podcasts right around their book launch, which makes sense, right? Because their goal at that time for both the author and the publisher is to sell as many books as possible. But maybe you haven't even written your book yet, you're self-publishing it, or maybe you launched your book months ago, or maybe you're launching new things like courses or a membership to take your book readers on a deeper journey with you than they got in the book. Everyone's at a different point of their author journey. So as we go through these 9 ways, think about where you are on yours. And by the way, I have a list of these 9 ways guesting on podcasts can help you build your author platform in a PDF that you can download, and I'll link to it in the show notes. So let's get into the 9 ways. So number 1 is you can earn trust faster to sell more books and programs. So podcast interviews typically give you 30 to 40 minutes to serve listeners and share messages from your book. Now, let me just make an important note. I'm talking about messages from your book, not your book itself. So there are some podcasts that are like they bring on certain authors and they're just there specifically to talk about the book they wrote and what it's all about. But most of the time, it's more about the message that you're going to share with the listeners from your book. So we're all about serving over selling here on the podcast. So the listeners may not even know you, and they'll quickly become leads as they connect with your personality and reach out to you after to learn more about your books and programs. So podcast interviews give you 30 to 40 minutes to serve listeners and share messages from your book. Your listeners may not even know you, and they'll quickly become leads as they connect with your personality and reach out after to learn more about your books and programs. Now, let me just put a little caveat in here that we are all about serving over selling. And so when you think about being a guest on podcasts, you want to go with that approach. You're there to serve the audience, not necessarily to come out front with selling your book. And we'll talk about that more in detail in future episodes. But again, number one, you can earn trust faster to sell more books and programs. Number two, you can speak to and impact more lives without leaving home. Our pandemic sure put emphasis on this one, but even before that, we all go through seasons of life when traveling away from our families on the weekends is just not doable. And remember what I talked about? You could show up to these events. You don't have to do your makeup and hair. You can even be in your pajamas. Gone are the days of having to travel on weekends. If that's not your desire, you can show up as a guest on podcast to serve your target readers from the comfort of your home. Number three, you can grow your email list and social media with your ideal audience. With a strong call to action, you can gain new subscribers and followers that are eager to learn more. You can offer an email lead magnet that ties into the topic you just shared, which will naturally lead them to your books and programs. Or maybe you're months away from your book launch and you just want to build a list of listeners that would be perfect for your book launch team. Perhaps you're wanting to grow one of your social media platforms where you know your target readers are hanging out. You have ideas for sharing content from your book in fun and creative ways, and you want to connect authentically one-on-one with your readers. So your strong call to action on an interview might be for listeners to connect with you on the social media platform that you're most active on. And hey, bonus points at tying those two together if you link your lead magnet in your profile of your social media platform. Number four, you establish relationships with podcast hosts. You may want to build some relationships with fellow authors who are podcast hosts, and maybe you're looking to do some creative collaborations in the future. Whether it's going in together and writing a book, several of my clients are co-authors, and it's been such a success. Maybe you want to do some training in each other's membership programs. Maybe you want to do an online summit together. Online summits are through the roof right now. I think I've signed up for one every week. The list is endless of creative collaborations you could do once you're a guest on a podcast. And maybe that's your goals. You just want to go serve other host audiences, build relationships with that podcast host more than anything, but of course, building a relationship with them through serving their audience. After an interview, you not only have a relationship that could turn into future collaborations, but you've also earned a referral to other podcast hosts if you show up to serve and serve well. Number five, you can attract agents and publishers. Do you ever hear you need to grow a platform first before traditionally publishing your book? Or maybe you're in the middle of writing your book proposal today and you're drawing a blank on what to put in the marketing section because it seems so far out there for when you're going to get around to marketing your book. But by guesting on podcasts, you can show agents and publishers that you're already working hard to reach your ideal readers. You're out serving them today. You know, typically we talk about all the events we're speaking at. Well, now we can do that through podcast guesting, and we'll continue to do that when the book launches. And so they see you're already thinking about your book marketing plan. And self-publishing coach Chad Allen talks about this as a guest on the Self-Publishing School podcast. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. I just love how Chad advocates for writing a book proposal, even if you're self-publishing. That way you've thought through your marketing plan way ahead of time. So number six, you can gain exposure for your own podcast. I've worked with several podcast hosts, and this was their main goal for podcast guesting, to gain exposure for their own show. You're serving target readers who are also podcast listeners, so it's a natural call to action to lead them to check out your own show. I know if you're like me, I'm always looking for a new show to add to my podcast player. Plus, if you're a podcast host, you have a leg up on other authors pitching themselves to be a guest on podcast, because some hosts put a priority on interviewing guests who can swap with them. Of course, it all depends on if it's a perfect fit for both shows, but it's an amazing way to build relationships and for both of you to serve both audiences. Number seven, you can repurpose your interview into new content. You can have your interview transcribed and use that for blog posts, for social media posts, future interview topics. The list is endless. Seriously, you'll be surprised by how many times you end an interview thinking, wow, I said some good stuff on there. So why not maximize it? Maybe you prefer speaking over writing, but you need to write some new blog posts. some new emails to your email list. So instead, you would rather go speak about a topic as a guest on other podcasts and repurpose that. You could also share it as an episode on your own podcast. I've seen a lot of podcast hosts do that, where they're guesting on each other's shows, and then they go live on the one podcast host show, and then later it'll go live on the other podcast host. Or they do like a really creative collaboration, like my friends Krista Hutchins and Esther Littlefield just recently did, and I'll put their links in the show notes, where they did a creative collaboration and it went live on both shows the same day. So it was the exact same interview on both shows, reached both audiences, and that's just so super cool. Number 8, you can increase website traffic. You have a new website reflecting your author brand. You have authors for your books, lead magnets, courses up, and need to drive traffic to it. And so every time you're on an interview with a podcast, they always have show notes and they always link to the guest website. They may not link anywhere else, but they always link to your website. Plus, have you noticed when you Google somebody nowadays, podcast episodes often pop up in the search first? How cool is that? Number 9, you become known as the go-to celebrated guest in your niche. I saved the best for last because really all these number 1 through 8 lead to this one. As you focus on serving over selling and delivering lots of value in your podcast interview, you will go from unknown author to the celebrated go-to guest everyone wants to have on their show and summit and speak at their conference. And what I mean by unknown is you're reaching new readers that are tuning into the show you're guesting on. You're becoming known by earning trust faster with those new readers. You're becoming known by showing up in the social feeds of new readers as they see hosts and listeners alike sharing your episode. You're becoming known by podcast hosts recommending you to other hosts and inviting you to be a speaker on their show, at their summit, or their conference. You're becoming known to agents and publishers as they hear you reaching your target readers long before and after a book releases. You're becoming known as more and more listeners discover and tune into your own podcast. You're becoming known as your name pops up in more Google searches. And it all starts by saying yes and showing up to serve a room full of your target readers. Y'all, I hope this was helpful to hear 9 ways you can build your author platform through podcast guesting. If you're ready to get started pitching yourself to podcast, I'd love to help. As your book marketing coach, we can work together to strategize and get you moving forward on pitching and guesting to reach new readers. Book a discovery call and let's chat, and I'll put the link here in the podcast player. That's all for today, and as always, I'll see you here next week to help you market your books one podcast at a time.